with RFK Jr. Second Senate hearing or sort of second session, more questions were asked about him, and in the upcoming weeks we might see the actual vote when it comes to his affirmation as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. We'll see how that one will go, since there are even few or a couple of Republicans that have a problem with him. But we'll mostly talk about what he said and also some of his past sort of statements when it comes to certain things, specifically health. Joining me today is Dr. Amesh Adalja, infectious disease physician and a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Adalja. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, and first thing I sort of want to ask you before we go even to some of his claims during the Senate hearings is, whenever sort of a normal person hears him talking about it, and I think this is why he sort of became popular, is whenever he's asked about what he thinks about vaccines, he just says, well, I just want them to be safe. I just want them to be safe and effective. And that's sort of, when a normal person hears that, he's like, well, what's wrong with that? But when you sort of go into sort of deeper things, oftentimes, I mean, I'll take a direct quote for him when he was on Lex Friedman. When he was asked about it, he said, I think some of the live virus vaccines are probably averting more problems than they are causing. There is no vaccine that is, safe and effective. And so, Dr. Adalja, first I'd like to ask you, what is the proper way to sort of think about when it comes to sort of safety and efficacy when it comes to vaccines?
So the first thing you have to recognize is that no medication has zero side effects. And anytime you think about a medication, and this applies to vaccines as well, there's a safety analysis you have to do, a trade-off between efficacy and safety and benefit. So the disease you're preventing has to be severe enough that it justifies a vaccine, first of all, and then the vaccine side effects have to not be outweighed by what you're actually preventing. So you've got this risk benefit analysis that you have to do. And for some viruses, so we don't always, so let's just take an example. So let's think about the yellow fever vaccine. The yellow fever vaccine is not recommended for everyone, not recommended for me here in Pittsburgh, because it's not a threat. And the side effects are outweighed by any kind of benefit. I wouldn't get any benefit from being a vaccinated person in Pittsburgh against yellow fever. But I travel to Peru, then the risk goes up. So it's worth that little risk that the vaccine has. So you always have to think about that balance based on what's the risk of the disease, what's the risk of the vaccine, and what's the benefit of the vaccine. And we do this continuously. It's not as if everybody gets recommended every vaccine all the time. There's a lot of people that dedicate a lot of time to getting it right on that cost benefit analysis that you have to do with vaccines. And it's really important with vaccines because you're giving them to healthy people. So when you look at the way we think about vaccines, it's a very different thing if you're giving a medication to a sick person who's already sick. But if somebody is healthy, the threshold for safety has to be much higher. And that's why it is such in the United States and in Europe and other places in the UK for vaccines, because that intervention is going to a healthy person, so it better be worth it. And I think people spend a tremendous amount of time and money to make sure they get that balance right. And so when RFK says that, it really evades everything that actually occurs. And I would caution anybody taking him at his word when he says he just wants vaccines to be safe, that he wants more data. All that stuff exists. He basically just ignores that it exists, and then uses that word to make people think, oh, this is a reasonable guy. He just wants safer vaccines, when there's no vaccine that he would ever think is safe. He at least in the past, I mean, he's changed his stripes a little bit to try and convince some senators to vote for him, but he's never said any vaccine is safe. He's actually been quoted talking, finding a parent carrying a little baby, going to those babies and going to those parents and saying, don't vaccinate your child against anything. So he's not as reasonable as some people might think he sounded, and I don't think he sounded reasonable at all, but any kind of softening, that was all just for show.
Yeah, and later I want to bring up a few more other things when it comes to sort of how someone like him even became popular. But let's cover some of the things the senators brought up at the Senate hearings. So one thing that sort of has been part of the sort of vaccines, and I think even RFK Jr. has been spreading it, is the idea that vaccines cause autism. And Bill Cassidy, a Republican, brought it up when he asked him, will you say unequivocally, will you reassure mothers unequivocally and without reservation that vaccines don't cause autism? And he went into basically saying, if you show me the data, I will be the first person to reassure the American people that they need to take those vaccines. And I think at the later part of the hearing, Bill Cassidy actually brought up some of the headlines, basically saying peer-reviewed studies show that there is no link, and Kennedy pretty much just cited a different study and said, "I just want to follow the science." And so, sort of, well, my first question would be, when it comes to, he says something like, well, if you show me the studies, then, I'll change my mind. But we are at the Senate hearing of him becoming the health secretary. Like, by this point, if you sort of don't have a made up mind about something like this, I feel like if you are actually honest, something went wrong in this. What do you make of of this idea of, like, I mean, you mentioned it, that we need more studies, or if you show me the studies, I'll change my mind.
So particularly with autism, those studies have been done multiple times over. And the worst thing about the autism stuff is that the initial study that got people scared about this was debunked, was found to be fraudulent. The person who authored that, the lead author, Andrew Wakefield, lost his medical license in the UK. And this is somebody that RFK Jr. says he wants to build a statue to. And that study, that debunked study trying to link autism with the MMR vaccine, is probably one of the it was a turning point in the anti-vaccine movement, and it's something that's taken a life of his own. So RFK Jr. knows that all those studies exist that have debunked this. Because of RFK Jr.'s last name, he's been able to meet personally with vaccine scientists, including individuals like Dr. Fauci. And he cannot be convinced because it's a fixed idea in his head. And he owes so much to the autism movement, the anti-vaccine movement, and the autism, that whole conglomeration is one of his claims to fame and one of his biggest supporters. So I don't think you'll ever see him move from that. But because Senator Cassidy was pushing him, he had to say something that, again, appeared reasonable, but he'll never disavow that because that's his claim to fame, and claim to fame, and he holds it as a religious fixed idea in his mind. It cannot be. No amount of data will ever satisfy RFK Jr. because he's actually said, I don't believe in data. I don't believe in the scientific method. And this is a deeper philosophical point, is that when someone tells you that it doesn't matter what the evidence says, doesn't matter the scientific method, there's no point in actually engaging with that person anymore. You're not going to find any kind of rationality there because they've already, and no amount of data, no things you show them are going to change their mind. It's like when you try and argue with the priest and you give them examples, of why something, water can't turn into wine. They're not going to believe it. It's an article of faith. And I think that so many people in the media think that you can try and reason RFK Jr. into a position if you just show him enough data, but he doesn't even believe in data. He doesn't even believe in the germ theory of disease. So I really think it's a non-starter with someone like him.
Yeah, I watched your interview with Michaela Peterson. I sort of recommend checking out. It was pretty good. But basically, first 45 minutes, she interviews RFK Jr., and then she interviews you. It's in one video. And a lot of things she brought up. I think something that RFK Jr. Almost depends on is sort of ignorance of people. I mean, when it comes to vaccines, when it comes to diseases, when it comes to the whole world, the stuff is complicated. And when someone just brings you up, well, what about this like one thing, you might not immediately know, as sort of like an average person, like what really is going on here. And someone, for example, brought up in the chat is I'll read the whole chat. Someone says, thought he was calling, meaning RFK Jr., for the same scrutiny of vaccine as any other drug that gets put on the market, and also giving parents a choice to not have to vaccinate for things like hepatitis B. And I believe hepatitis B was one of the things that was even brought up in the interview with Michaela Peterson. So how would you answer to someone saying, well, he just wants, again, he just wants the same scrutiny as any other sort of drugs that are put on the market?
Okay, so a couple of things. So the podcast interview I did with Michaela Peterson, he refused to be on screen with me at the same time. That's why, you said they're back to back. actually interviews him and then interviews me because he wouldn't do it with me, because he doesn't want direct challenges to him. So that's how that turned out. And vaccines are actually scrutinized more than drugs because, again, they're giving them to healthy people. We give drugs to people who have a condition, whether that means, they might have COVID or they might have flu, they might have a bacterial infection, they might have hypertension, whatever it might be. The scrutiny on a drug is lower than on a vaccine because you're giving it to a healthy person, as I mentioned earlier. So that statement of RFK's is completely false. And regarding the hepatitis B vaccine, so parents do have choice. You don't have to. There's no vaccines in the United States that are required as a condition of life. Schools have their own entry requirements, and that would be the case even if we had a private school system, and private schools do have their own vaccine requirements. So that's what schools do. They say, if you're going to come to our school, you need to have these vaccines or have a medical exemption. And most places are pretty open, liberal with exemptions if there's any kind of medical condition. So I don't think that, he brings up this hepatitis B thing because this is a vaccine, the first dose of which is recommended to a child before they leave the hospital. And that's because they're trying to prevent mother-to-child transmission of hepatitis B. And before we did that, we had mother-to-child transmission of hepatitis B occurring in the United States. There may come a time when hepatitis B is rare enough in the United States that we don't need to do that. But right now, it's still an issue. And, I think you talk about the vaccine. They always say hepatitis B vaccine, hepatitis B vaccine. First of all, it's a very safe vaccine. It has no real side effects. It's one of the cleanest, safest vaccines we have. Number two, they never talk about why you're giving it. You're not just giving it to check a box. Because the issue is if you contract hepatitis B as a baby, you are most likely to get chronic hepatitis B, which will then lead to liver cancer. So hepatitis B vaccine prevents liver cancer. You never hear people who rail against hepatitis B vaccine talk about what it's actually trying to prevent. They often think about the vaccines as there's something that people are just getting, as a fashion accessory. They're actually not fashion accessories. They're actually meant to protect you from real threats, and that a lot of time and effort goes into designing a vaccine schedule that meets those threats when they occur. And the hepatitis B, before you leave the hospital after you're born, that's because of mother-to-child transmission of hepatitis B. And everyone has a choice. You don't have to get the vaccines. That's kind of a falsehood. It's school entry requirements is a separate thing, but it's not as a condition of being alive that you have to get these vaccines.
Yeah, and again, those arguments sort of saying, well, RFK Jr. just wants more freedom, as if RFK Jr. was like a poster child for like capitalism or individual choice or individual rights. Again, it's sort of like putting these two things together that don't really fit. Let me read a few super chats we have. So first, Alejandro, thank you so much. He says, thanks for being a voice of reason, Dr. Adalja. Thank you so much. We have a super chat from Jonathan. Thank you so much. He says, very sorry I didn't have a chance to say hi to Dr. Adalja in Florida. Great guy. There was a recent conference. I'm assuming you've attended since Jonathan mentions it. We also have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. A super chat from Mary. Thank you. And a super chat from Jeff. Thank you so much. He says, I thought Republicans were opposed to the nanny state. I opposed the mandates, but it was my choice to risk taking the mRNA when I needed the government papers to live life. Thank you for your clear information.
I just want to pick up on that last thing about the nanny state. So one of the things that's interesting about the anti-vaccine movement is historically in the United States, it had been a phenomenon of the far left. So we have this, very liberal places, very leftist places like Marin County, California, which is near San Francisco, Oregon, parts of Washington state, where the very far left was residing. That's where we had these pockets of anti-vaccine. And places like Mississippi, West Virginia, which are deep red states, had the highest vaccination rates. But something happened with COVID. And now you have an alignment of the very far left and the very far right on becoming anti-vaccine. And I don't know if it is probably for sort of the same reasons, but it's a very scary alliance. And this explains, you're going to ask me about RFK Jr.'s rise, but this explains why RFK Jr. has now been embraced by Republicans when no Kennedy has ever been embraced by Republicans. And it's because of this alignment, which I think is very, very scary. And right now, and it's real. In places, in certain parts of Texas, like Gaines County, Texas, right now, some of the kindergartners only have a 50% vaccination rate against measles. And there's a measles outbreak right now in the double digits in Texas. And so these have real consequences. And I think, this idea of the nanny state type of thing, RFK Jr. is a nanny state type of person, and he's trying to tell you not to get the vaccines. He's telling you to drink unpasteurized milk. He's telling you to eat this, don't do this. You have to think of him that way. I think you have to think deeply. What is he? He came to power as an environmentalist, and we can talk about that in a second. But he really is about back to nature, and as most environmentalists are, they often do have prescriptions for how you should live, and part of his just happens to be don't put vaccines in your body.
Yeah, so there are a few more other things from the Senate hearing I'd like to bring up. So Michael Bennett, a Democrat, has also asked Kennedy whether he had said that Lyme disease is highly likely a militarily engineered bioweapon. First, Kennedy said that I probably did say that. Later, he tried to deny it, but I think at the end he said something like, "What I have said is that we should always follow evidence, no matter what it says." And again, sort of, and I think he later even brought up something like, "We should sort of." I'm just bringing to attention to people that something like this is happening, and
Yeah. So
yeah.
what I'll say about that is, so there had been this idea that Lyme disease appeared on Long Island, um, escaped from a U.S. government veterinary laboratory on Plum Island, which is off the coast of Long Island, and that has been circulating for some time, but it's been thoroughly debunked. Lyme disease, even though it was first diagnosed in the United States in the 1970s, had been spreading in other parts of the world before then. It was just a convenient thing, and I think when something unexplained happens, people try to turn to that it's some conspiracy, some way to explain what might be occurring. And obviously there have been conspiracies that have been true, but this is not one. But I think the more that what it is just kind of RFK Jr. trying to say, I'm on the side of people trying to find things out. Things are being hidden from us, and I'm this champion of truth and safety and transparency, when the exact opposite is probably true. And he is a purveyor of misinformation. So almost any type of misinformation that comes his way, he amplifies it.
Specifically, what I wanted to say, I think John Hickenlooper, a
Yeah.
Democrat, has basically brought it up later, saying, I think at a certain point, if you're going to be an activist or a prophet, what you say becomes promoting something, promoting an idea. But Kennedy has said, I never endorsed the issue. Now talking about Lyme disease being a bioweapon, I said it's out there. But here I would again bring up, like, if he gets affirmed, he will be someone with authority. He will be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. When he says something, even this is something I'll just bring up separately. I oftentimes see from Elon Musk, where he just like reposts something with like no context and nothing, and it's like, well, look at this. But like at some point you have to realize you are someone who is famous, you are someone who now even will have sort of the governmental authority, and you cannot just say, well, I just think people should read it. I mean, what do you make of this idea that, well, I'm just letting people know something like this is out there, when he is someone with a certain amount of authority?
I think it's irresponsible because he knows that people are going to take what he says as true. And while people have a responsibility on their own to read through things and not just accept things on faith, a lot of people don't. And he knows that and cashes in on it. Otherwise, why would he be promoting something like this? And I think that yes, there is you don't want to be in an amplifier of false information or information that's not that could be harmful to people. And if you're going to promote that stuff, or if you're going to even draw attention to it, it's important to kind of caveat it, saying, I disagree with this, or I don't have the information here, but this is, he doesn't do that. He's not doing that. He is literally promoting those types of things as part of an idea that the government's work in infectious disease is dangerous. That's kind of something he believes. He believes that, meddling with nature is bad. And obviously research and science have to work on nature. And I think this goes back to him as an environmentalist. I think that he really um, deeply believes that that's the only one fundamental philosophical thing I can feel. I think he's a nihilist, but I think it's an environmental type of nihilist where he wants nature to kind of run its course and nature to be left alone. And that's why he comes up with thinks that anything bad that happens to humans it's because humans did something to nature, that they were working with Lyme disease, or they've made a vaccine, or whatever it might be.
So I also want to go into a few things that might happen if he does become the health secretary. But is there anything else that really jumped out to you during either of the Senate hearing sessions?
I think it's really important to understand why he was picked. So during COVID, Donald Trump put together something called Operation Warp Speed, which is a highly successful program to develop a vaccine in less than a year. And it was a smashing success, unprecedented. And this is something that the Trump administration deserves credit for. And because it got us got us out of the pandemic. But he's not been able to claim that because he's now appealed to a base that believes the COVID-19 vaccines are poison. So he needs to apologize to them. He needs to show them he's changed, that he doesn't really believe in Operation Warp Speed. So how do you do that? You pick somebody that's the poster child for like RFK Jr. for the anti-vaccine movement. And it's important to know that all of these viewpoints of RFK Jr.'s have been known for decades. And he wasn't picked in spite of them. He was picked because of them. So that's the more depraved aspect of this, is that Donald Trump chose to do this rather than pick someone that actually believes in the germ theory of disease or believes that HIV causes AIDS or has a legitimate scientific mind. And I think that's the worst part. That is why he was picked.
Yeah, I think that is really something that's almost sad about Trump because there's so many things that are, there are few things that were good, but oftentimes they are sort of like gray, sort of like maybe on the better side, but sort of still kind of bad. But Operation Warp Speed was one of the things which is like, wow, this is like, this shows American sort of exceptionalism almost. The fact that something like that was done, and he pretty much is unable to claim the credit for it because now he's sort of accepted into sort of like vaccine denialism. Um, then so we'll have the Senate confirmation. I'm not sure when the vote is. I'm not sure if it was announced, but basically Republicans have 53 seats. With three of the seats are supposed to maybe they might vote against, which I believe would still be able to be broken by vice president. And also there's no filibuster anymore since they got rid of that, so no way to stop that. I mean, this might not be something you really watch as much, but what do you think? How do you think the vote will go? Do you think will we see maybe greater pushback against him, or do you think it will just go through?
I think it will just go through. I don't think they'll need to even go to tiebreak. I think that maybe Mitch McConnell, who is a polio survivor himself, Mitch McConnell may vote against him. I don't know that. I don't think Cassidy is not going to vote against him because he voted for him in committee, and some of the other Republican senators. I just don't see the opposition. That it's become a very tribal party, and this is who the president wants to be HHS secretary, and Michael Cassidy I think is a great example. This is a senator that's going to be up for reelection and does not want Donald Trump to put up a challenger in the primary election, and that unfortunately, even for the better senators, they still will sell out principle for political power, and I think that's what's going to happen here. I don't think that there's going to be any major roadblock, and probably by the end of the week, RFK Jr. will be the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and will be all the worse for it.
Yeah, and so now we still have a little bit of time, so let's talk about if it does become the health secretary, what that might mean. I'll bring up sort of my own example from Slovakia. I'm not sure how much you watch Slovak politics, but basically we had election in 2023, and after that we had a new position created, something like expert for investigating pandemic. And basically the person who got that position was someone who doesn't even believe pandemic happened. Basically came out saying like nothing happened, nothing was wrong, we shouldn't have done anything. And that sort of really filled me with dread, because now I know when a new pandemic hits, we will not be ready for it. Nothing will get changed. We won't get any new preparations. And that's sort of my biggest question when it comes to him becoming health secretary is what do you think will be his influence on the different agencies, maybe specifically the CDC, when it comes to sort of, things went wrong during COVID, but now we have to sort of move on and sort of see if we can prepare better. And can we do it with someone like RFK at the head of Secretary of Health and Human Services?
I think no. First of all, he doesn't even believe. He said that he has doubts about the germ theory of disease. That's the whole underpinning of pandemics. Pandemics don't occur if there's no such thing as the germ theory of disease. Then you have to think about the types of people he attracts to Health and Human Services, and the CDC is part of HHS. So the CDC is an agency within HHS, and the CDC director that President Trump has designated is a guy named Dave Weldon, who made his name to his fame in Congress by being an anti-vaccine person. Somebody, and he's also a physician too, which is worse. Who had been going after, pushing the mercury and vaccine danger, that hoax around, and he held congressional hearings. So it's not good. RFK Jr. has also said we need to take a break from infectious disease. And how can you do pandemic preparedness if you need to take a break from infectious disease? Right now in the United States, not only are we, we're in the midst of a bird flu issue that's happening on our dairy farms, our poultry farms. There's a lot of government coordination that needs to occur to be ready for this bird flu or some other bird flu that's going to come in the future. And I just think that this is the worst recipe for inaction and fouling things up way worse than what we could imagine with COVID-19. And some of these viruses are not going to be forgiving. Right now, bird flu has been pretty forgiving. It doesn't infect humans very efficiently, but there will be a virus that will be much more efficient in transmission, and you need expert people at the helm. And RFK Jr. is not an expert, and the people that he attracts are going to be more in his, people that he approves of. And if RFK Jr. approves of you, that's not a good thing. It's probably a really bad mark against you. So, and there's people that will leave. The better people will leave, because why would you want to work for someone like RFK Jr.? So I think we are in a worse situation probably than with COVID-19.
I'll bring up one more agency, specifically the FDA. So the FDA director is appointed by president, but sort of reports to the secretary. And I don't know how much basically control will RFK have, but the way he has been talking about when it comes to safety of drugs and vaccines, will we pretty much see nothing getting approved for the next 4 years as long as he is the health secretary, since he pretty much, his standard is almost like platonic, out of this world?
I don't know what will happen. And I know the FDA commissioner designate personally. He's a friend of mine and a good person, a scientist. I might disagree with him on certain issues, but he is a scientist and knows what he's talking about, and a reasonable person. I don't know how people like that will fare with RFK Jr. I think it will be very difficult to rise or to have any kind of autonomy in HHS. The secretary controls a lot, and RFK Jr., President Trump has said that RFK Jr. was put there to go wild on health. So he's likely to have major influences on all the subsidiary agencies of HHS. And it's going to be a tough 4 years. And if any kind of emergency response needs to occur, I'm not confident that we will come out of this as good as we did with COVID. Because imagine, during COVID, we had emergency use authorizations. You had the FDA basically working on Operation Warp Speed real time. I can't imagine that type of thing happening with RFK Jr. as the secretary.
We have a super chat from Jonathan. Thank you so much. He says, Amesh know his stuff. I definitely believe so. And an interesting question from Bonnie. She says, maybe Dr. Adalja won't agree, but I don't think this department should even exist. Maybe, I'm not sure if she means FDA or CDC, but what would be your question, as a sort of a capitalist, when it comes to sort of the existence on these agencies? And then quickly, I think there is also a separate question, sort of if they exist, what it means when someone like RFK is at the head of it.
So one thing I would say is that when it comes to communicable disease control, there definitely is a role for government, and you don't have the right to infect other people. And the government has a role in control of contagious diseases. And that's something that even Ayn Rand talks about. And I know Jonathan's in the new textbook of Americanism. I refer you to that Q&A with her, where she talks about some of the issues with vaccines, where there's some issues about communicable disease that come up there. So I think there is a role for the government in the control of communicable diseases. And that is why I'm really focusing on RFK Jr.'s issues with infectious disease, because that, I think, is a crucial thing where we're going to rely on the government. The other point is that we don't live in a capitalist system. We don't have a perfect government in the United States, and there are many things that government does today that maybe wouldn't be done in an ideal situation. But that doesn't mean you want them to do it incompetently. Governments run buses. Governments run Amtrak. You don't want the Amtrak. You want the Amtrak trains. You want the buses to run competently, even if you don't think that's a role for government. And I think that's the broader issue here, is that we all rely on this. And we saw what happened during COVID. So where you draw the line for where the appropriate government role is and where there isn't, what you still want is competence in the actual action, because that puts all of our lives at stake, and we are beholden to that system, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and we're pretty much out of time. So, Dr. Adalja, any last thoughts, and also maybe where can people find you if they want to follow more of your stuff? Anything you'd like to
I think
promote?
this is. I think that the RFK Jr. nomination is emblematic. I think it's disastrous. I think this is a nihilist, a destroyer sent there to destroy health, not to actually promote it. And I think we will be worse off when it occurs. And I think this is an area where we want to really focus your criticisms on. Focus your criticisms because I think it's going to have real world consequences. If people want to follow me, I'm on Twitter. It's at Amesh Ameshaa. I have a Substack, though it's not been updated as well, which you can find me some of my writing there as well. Thanks.
And people can also will be on the reality show in just about a minute or so. Link for that is in the chat. Thank you again, Dr. Adalja, for joining me today. Thank you everybody for watching, and bye bye.
Bye.